Howdy, it is now 3 o'clock, so I guess I will get this started. I've just been going through my bookshelf of all these books that I've read the last 5 years and that I wanted to share with people, and I just didn't. And this book is a book that I've had sitting around for a while called The Nazis and the Occult by D. Sklar. And this is from the 70s. So this was published, let's see here, 1977. Dusty Sklar, something tells me that's a pen name. What's interesting about this copy is that it came from a bookstore in Texas, and there was a person reading it before that when you buy used books, it's always a chance that you're going to get, somebody else's underlining and things like that. And whoever was reading it, I think, got really upset that this wasn't going to be like a total indictment of Judaism. um, and the reason why I think this is so interesting and like relevant now is I've said this before. I think, history doesn't really repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I feel like 2020 25 is sort of a parallel to the 1920s of, a rise in anti-Semitism, a rise in the interest of the occult. You have people saying that Hitler wasn't that bad. And I think it's really interesting. Also, like this interest in nationalism and populism, all of these things seem to be happening again. So I don't really remember how I heard about this book, but I will go ahead and read the acknowledgments, I guess. I'll start there. And then we'll read chapter 1, and based on how I'm feeling, maybe we'll do chapter 2 as well. Chapter 2 and 1 are not very long. In fact, the chapters of this book are not very long, nor is the book itself. So let's start. So this is the page that has the acknowledgments on it. It says, "In preparing this book, I have drawn on a wide variety of sources. The bibliography should not be taken as representing the whole of my source material, but rather as a list of suggestions for further reading," which is why I think books are so great. You can always, especially nonfiction, you can go and see what they used for their research, and it pulls so many threads if you're doing your own research. I really miss I really miss going to a library and spending like half a day there. I don't even know how kids do their research now. I guess they just ask Grok or something. The writer goes on to say, "I owe a special debt of gratitude to my husband David and my son Stephen for their encouragement. Hugh Rawson, my editor, performed the weary task of scrutinizing the manuscript. Translation assistance was given by Hans Karlsruher. It is not possible for me to thank all of the members of esoteric groups in America and England for information given in a spirit of cooperation and with a desire to enlarge our understanding of an emotionally charged, controversial subject." And so also, this is the late 70s. During that time period, there was also, I don't think the interest in the occult ever really goes away. And as many of you know, the word occult really only means hidden. And personally, I believe there can be a dark side and a light side. So, I mean, I have a lot of ideas concerning that, but what I think is very important to understand about Nazis and Nazism is that it was extremely satanic. It was a complete inversion. Hitler hated Christianity. He thought it made people weak. He often lamented the fact that the German people were Christian and not more like the Islamic imams that he would align himself with. So let's read this quote. In the beginning, it's a Spinoza quote. It says, "Being frequently driven into straits where rules are useless, and being often kept fluctuating pitiably between hope and fear by the uncertainty of fortune's greedily coveted favors, They are consequently, for the most part, very prone to credulity. The human mind is readily swayed this way or that in times of doubt, especially when hope and fear are struggling for mastery. In adversity, they know not where to turn, but beg and pray for counsel from every passer-by. No plan is then too futile, too absurd, or too fatuous for their adoption. And that's a Spinoza quote. So this is chapter 1, Hidden Roots, which begins with a Hannah Arendt quote. Quote, real power begins where sorry, let me start that again, because I think it's important, and I did underline that. Real power begins where secrecy begins, the only rule of which everybody in a totalitarian state may be sure. Okay, so let me just read that again, because I think it's very important in understanding how power functions. And I do believe, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think that groups get together in order to gain power, and they often do it, without broadcasting what they're doing. And I think that's how it works, as Hannah Arendt points out here. So one more time. Real power begins where secrecy begins, the only rule of which everybody in a totalitarian state may be sure. Many books have been written about Hitler and the Holocaust. Many reasons suggested to account for them. It is said that Germany in the 1930s was economically and spiritually bankrupt, that Hitler and his henchmen were madmen, or simple opportunists, or petty bureaucrats, or some combination of all three, perhaps. But one explanation tends to contradict another, and when all are combined, they merge into a solution so general that nothing is explained. Understandably, then, many people are still not satisfied that the grotesque events of the Third Reich have been adequately dealt with by historians. And I want to note that this book is from the 70s, one more time, and I know there's been a wealth of books written since this book concerning the Nazis and the occult, but this is the one that happens to be on my bookshelf. In all this complicated story, there is one question which cries out for an answer. How is it that the theorists have missed a vital element, even when they themselves provide important clues? That element is the occult. Many historians have alluded to the Nazi Party's origins in an occult sect, to the occult leanings of leading Nazi officials, to the mystical rites of the SS and the Hitler Youth, to the establishment of a bureau devoted exclusively to the occult during World War II. It now seems puzzling that they should not have also given as much consideration to the underlying basis for these odd phenomena as they gave to economic and social factors. That they did not is, of course, evidence of their own dismissal, quite reasonably, of a crankish pseudoscience, right? They don't want to, and I see this a lot in the academy, not just concerning World War II or the Nazis, but when we talk about literature, we often leave out the occult influences of some of the authors involved, like William Blake, for example. I mean, I had a teacher that totally didn't even acknowledge that inspiration for him. So I always think it's interesting that the materialist analysis really wants to deny that this can be a factor, a motivating factor in philosophies of many, in art, in etc. But this has led inevitably to selective blindness. In order not to be accused of giving credence to irrational beliefs, they have failed to see those beliefs in their proper historical perspective. Since early studies always influence later ones, the interpretation of Nazi origins has tended to remain pretty much the same for the past 2 decades. All the same, people do not have a subliminal awareness, or so do seem to have a subliminal awareness, that the Nazis were involved in occultism. Often one comes across references such as these. Quote, the Nazi horror reveals how satanic the human soul can become. Quote, if there is anything fundamentally diabolic about Anton LaVey, it stems from the echo of Nazism in his theories. Quote, it was predictable that Charles Manson would identify with Hitler, for they both have been motivated by a kindred demonic spirit, and they are comparable personalities. The current occult revival has placed us in a better position to examine the Nazi horror from a different perspective and gives ample ground for believing that occult beliefs and practices, however weird, played a major part in the irrational history of the Third Reich. Some scholars may have been thrown off the scent because Hitler went to great pains to eradicate occultism from Germany almost as soon as he came to power, and on that account is mistakenly identified as the enemy of irrational faith. So what I think Hitler was trying to do was make Nazism the state religion. And so that's why I don't think, I think he was very inspired by the occult, as we'll see. Let's continue. On the contrary, as will be borne out in later chapters, the occult was purged not because it was abhorrent, but because the Nazis took it seriously. So seriously indeed that it posed a potential threat. The astrologer William Wolff, who was put to work by the SS casting horoscopes of nations, groups, and movements, describes in Zodiac and Swastika Heinrich Himmler's confession of his own interest in and practice of occultism and his explanation of the purge. Quote, for us, politics means the elimination of all forces except those serving the one constructive idea. In the Third Reich, we have to forbid astrology. We cannot permit any astrologers to follow their calling except those who are working for us. In the National Socialist state, astrology must remain a privileged singularium. It is not for the broad masses. And that's kind of an occult idea, a very dark one, I think, where it's not for the profane, right? It's not for people like you and me. It's for the illuminated ones. And so also let's look up who's this guy, William Wolff. See if we can find a picture of him. And I'll see if anyone's here. William Wolff. Astrologer. Let's see if we can find an image of this guy. So I guess this is his book. So that might be something. Yeah, Himmler was super into it. That might be something you could read if you were interested in this topic. So let's see if anyone's here. I got two people. Get my Vril on. The older the better. Modern books kind of stink a lot of the time. every Nisa thinks they're illuminating. Yeah, it does kind of look like an interesting book. So that's who William Wolff is or was, and I don't really know too much about him. Let us switch back over to our picture of the book we're reading so we don't get confused. The Holocaust appeared in a new light when I began some time ago to investigate certain modern esoteric cults making claims to paranormal knowledge. These cults, from those connected with George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, Madame Helena Blavatsky, and Rudolf Steiner, to their present reincarnations, shared certain features: an authoritarian obedience to a charismatic and Masonic leader. Messianic. Secrecy, loyalty to the group above all other ties, a belief in supernatural possibilities open to the members only, a belief in reincarnation, initiation into superhuman sources of power, literal acceptance of the myth of ancient giants or supermen who handed down an oral tradition to a chosen people and who are guiding us now, and in uncommon cases, satanic practices. I think it's probably more common than this author wants to admit. Glaring parallels to Nazi history. Turning back to that history and its antecedents, I saw an unmistakable evidence of a direct relationship between the Nazis and occultism. In fact, it was hard not to see. Here was the missing link in our understanding of the beasts who proclaimed themselves gods. If it seems too fantastic to believe that one of the most civilized countries in the world should have fallen to occultism, here is a highly respected German historian, an exiled former staff member of the liberal newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung, Konrad Hayden, observing in his introduction to the memoirs of Dr. Felix Kirsten, Heinrich Himmler's Monsieur, that among the Germans, quote, the best of them found refuge from the despair of their daily life in a perverse fanaticism called the mysticism of a political movement. Germany was the perfect place for this development. In almost no other country were so many miracles performed, so many ghosts conjured, so many illnesses cured by magnetism, so many horoscopes read between the two world wars. A veritable mania of superstition had seized the country, and all those who made a living by exploiting human stupidity thought the millennium had come. General Erich Ludendorff, who had commanded the German armies in World War I, tried to make gold with the assistance of a swindler boasting the appropriate name Tausend, meaning thousand. There was scarcely a folly in natural or world history to which the great general did not lend credence. When the German Republic, which he hated so intensely, had the barriers of the railway crossings painted red and white for better visibility, Ludendorff declared that the Jews and the government were doing this because Moses had led the Jews through the desert under these colors. Who is this Ludendorff? Let's look up Ludendorff. I think this is my favorite part of reading these books out loud to you guys, is looking up the pictures of the people involved. Ludendorff. Here he is. Looking really happy. Has very German. This is very German to me, just to look serious. And so this guy was saying that they painted these bridges to represent Judaism. Another high-ranking general was convinced that he possessed the secret of the death ray and that he could halt airplanes in their flight and stop tanks in their tracks. A steamship company dismissed its managing director because his handwriting had displeased a graphologist. Motorists avoided a certain road between Hamburg and Bremen because it was rumored from milestone number 113 there emanated certain mysterious terrestrial rays which provoked one accident after another. A miracle worker who had the faculty of making the dead Bismarck appear during his mass meetings and who healed the sick by application of white cheese had enough followers to establish a city. Another crackpot was almost elected to the Reichstag, and still a third, who also barely missed election, promised to perform the greatest miracle of all by undoing the German inflation that had depreciated the mark to the value of 1 trillion paper marks for 1 gold mark. Among Hitler's intimates was a man on whose visiting card appeared the word magician to indicate his profession, and he meant it seriously. Many were convinced that the course of world history was the sinister result of the ministrations of ancient secret societies. Does this sound familiar? As such, they considered not only the Freemasons, but also the Jews and the Jesuits. Other historians have corroborated that Germany between the two world wars was particularly ripe for these states of mind. It was a time of alienation and impotence. World War I had turned everything inside out. Apart from the physical devastations, the three bugbears of taxation, inflation, and confiscation sapped the strength of the middle class. The war itself was but a symptom of growing inner turbulence in Europe. The trouble had, of course, begun much earlier. In Germany particularly, the gap between an advancing technology and an outmoded social order was great. In the years preceding World War I, the German Jews were in an especially vulnerable position. The full emancipation of the German Jews, which had come in 1871, brought large numbers of Eastern European Jews to Germany. They settled in the cities, taking a prominent part in commercial, cultural, and political life. Likewise, the period from 1857 to 1910 saw a rise in the Jewish population of Vienna of more than 400%. Because of the high value the Jews placed on learning, a disproportionately large number went into the medical and legal professions, trying in that way to gain a modicum of social acceptance. Some Germans, of course, mistook those professions for the average Jew. Slowly, a new religion evolved for those Germans who felt somehow cheated, a cult of race based on the supremacy of the Aryans and the vilification of the Jews. It was called the Volkisch, or Pan-German, movement, and it enjoyed a great popular appeal. It began a virulent campaign against the foreign element. A racial theory of history was developed, and it heralded the coming of a new Messiah. The mystical concepts of Reich and Volk went along with such an awakening interest in the occultism. Secret cults sprang up, anti-Semitic and nationalistic, running like a sewer beneath Vienna and other cultural centers. Two Austrian occultists, Georg Lanz von Liebenfels and Guido von List, presented an irrational pseudo-anthropological package which attracted a number of wealthy backers despite its foolishness. Lanz's Order of New Templars and List's Armenen boasted several influential members. So before I started this, I looked up some pictures of Georg Lanz. And this was a magazine. This was the occult magazine in Germany at the time, Ostara. And in fact, I found like a really old copy of it, this old scanned-in copy from, I think it says 1927 down here. So this was a very popular thing that was happening in the zeitgeist of Germany at this time. Let's see. So this is another image of him. And then, of course, you have Guido von List. I thought this was kind of an interesting image. We'll leave it on that tab there. In 1909, young Adolf Hitler, down and out in Vienna, came across Lanz's magazine's Ostara and made contact with the occultist. The erotic language and racist rantings of this magazine were remarkably similar to Hitler's later utterances. A lot of people deny this connection, but I think it's fairly apparent. Put that on there. Membership in occult groups was often interlocking. When in 1912 a new secret cult, the Germanen Orden, was born, disciples of both Lanz and List joined. The Germanen Orden was like the other occult racist nationalist groups, but with a difference. It called for courageous men to accomplish the work of combating the Social Democrats who had gained ground in the elections of 1912. Courageous men did not leap forth to join the Germanen Orden, but after World War I, prospects were brighter. People were in a state of shock over the German defeat, which had brought with it the collapse of Kaiser Wilhelm II's regime. Power was suddenly thrust into the hands of a provisional democratic government whose unenviable task it was to accept the consequences of a lost war, reluctantly surrender, and sign a peace treaty. Extremists of the left and right blamed everything on this government. Germany's humiliation, as well as the reparations, which bore heavily financially and psychologically on the people. It was the end of an era. The Germans had gone into the war with such high hopes. The war was to have been a release from care, a cleansing of mounting economic and social problems, a purging and purification. When the war began, said one German, it was as if a nightmare had vanished, as if a door had opened, an old yearning had been satisfied. The idea of war itself had become beautiful. It was to give people back their lives. Peace, as someone pointed out, had become insupportable. Hitler embodied the alienated man with no family or occupation to whom the outbreak of World War I was a godsend. He later confessed, quote, "For me, as for every German, there now began the greatest and most unforgettable time of my earthly existence." When the Germans signed the peace treaty, the army released almost 250,000 men to add to their numbers to the growing ranks of the unemployed. Many soldiers were dazed to come home to fatherland on the edge of anarchy, hungry, and undisciplined. The new Russian Revolution threatened to spill over into Germany. In Munich particularly, communists stalked the streets, threatening civil war. Conservatives and liberals alike were anxious to do anything to stave off communism. The Germanen Orden was happy to merge its destiny with a Munich group called the Tool Society, which was meeting regularly to study the supposed occult meaning of the ancient Germanic alphabet and its symbolism. It was led by an astrologer who called himself Baron Rudolf von Sabbatendorf. Let's look him up really quick. Well, I think I will read chapter 2 because we're almost at the end of this chapter. But I think my purpose in reading this book is to draw the parallels of today with then. We are in a pretty turbulent time. We're facing a lot of issues in the West. They're not the same, obviously. Like I'm saying, history rhymes; it doesn't repeat. But there has been, since 2020 at least, I think there was an explosion in the interest of the New Age and these sort of, I don't know if I would call them solutions, but these sort of these ideas that like seem to help people make sense of everything, even if these ideas don't really logically make sense. I don't know if that made sense. Wait, so let's let's look up this guy, the Tool Society guy. So let's look up Tool Society first, and I'll check in and see what you guys are saying, if anything. So here we have some, what is this? Oh my goodness. DuckDuckGo, his image search is always so weird. So here's some images when you type in Tool Society, and then let me see, what was this guy's name? Baron. Let's see if it comes up. Baron Rudolf von, oh my goodness, Sabbatendorf. Well, he looks pleasant. Let's see if we can, let's open up a Google image search because oftentimes it's better. Nope, that's the guy. This guy looks super trustworthy. Look at him. All right, what's going on in the chats here? Yeah, I think let me look it up because I think it's not just the name of that magazine. It's the name of something more general. Hold on. It's a pagan holiday that celebrates the spring equinox. Um, so it's an older, I guess, like occult or esoteric concept, uh, or a pagan concept, but also a goddess. Here, so an Anglo-Saxon goddess from the 8th century. So here's an image for you guys. That's pretty cool. I think the late 1800s were a really interesting time period. Seemed a lot like there was a lot of optimism. Um, so funny you left the new age in 2020. I still do some things that would probably be considered blasphemous, but that's just me. Um, I mean, I got a lot of crap from people for talking about Jesus and digging Jesus so much, but um, you know, yeah. Uh, hey, I'm gonna do what I need to do. Um, I haven't had a total conversion. Um, anyway, let's continue. Let's finish this chapter, and then I guess there's 4 people here, even though Terry's the only one that's brave enough to type into the chat. If you're here, say hello and interact with Terry. Um, so let's finish this chapter, and then I think I will read chapter 2. So let's put a picture of the Tool Society guy up on again, even though he's ugly and scary looking. All right, so this guy who was an astrologer, um, formed the Tool Society, which was meeting regularly to study the supposed occult meaning of the ancient Germanic alphabet. It was led by this guy, blah, blah, blah. The Tool Society soon became the political arm of the Germanen Orden and quietly set about preparing for a counter-revolution against the government. It formed an umbrella for many of the racist nationalist groups and enlisted frightened or unscrupulous men against the government, which it said had betrayed the German people. In addition to rabid anti-Semitism, it preached the coming of a Führer who would do away with hated democracy, the handmaiden of the weak. It began to collect weapons, and that's another thing that I think people need to notice about these so-called like right-wing talking heads is that they're pretty satanic. You know, they don't believe in democracy. Um, and so, again, I think that's why it's interesting to read books like this and to study the past, um, so that you can draw parallels and you can spot, you know, who these people really are and what they believe in, which is fascism. And I am, you know, I'm not going to apologize. I think democracy, I think America, I think our Constitution is very special and it should be preserved. It's very important. So let's continue here. It began to collect weapons, bought a newspaper, instigated terrorist activity, and stirred up race hatred against the Jews, all the while keeping up the front of being a study group for Germanic antiquity. Tool members who were to play key roles in the formation of the Nazi Party were Alfred Rosenberg, Rudolf Hess, Gottfried Feder, Karl Harrer, and Dietrich Eckart. Not until they found their Führer, Adolf Hitler, were they able to carry out the irrational programs of Lanz, Liszt, and Sabotendorf. But all the essential ingredients, the ideology, the rituals, the symbols, the attitudes of the coming Nazi revolution were already present in the Germanen Orden and the Tool Society, as well as the Order of the New Templars and the Armenen. So the next chapter is called Giants in the Earth, and it quotes Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days. And let me see if anyone is saying, hello, GM Car. Welcome to this reading. Yeah, everyone, please say hello, interact with each other. I'm glad that my two regulars are here, and I appreciate you both. So yeah, I guess I'll continue. It's only been 37 minutes, and this chapter isn't very long either. I do like to read the chapters before I'm going to read them to you, and I haven't done that, but whatever, shogunai, as the Japanese say, cannot be helped. Let's check it out. Take a sip of Terry. I saw you were drinking Diet Dr. Pepper the other night, and I am too. Anyway, so let's continue. We're talking about the Nephilim, right? So let's try to find a picture of that. And I gotta say, the reason why I do like DuckDuckGo's image search a little bit better is because it lets you open up the image in a more, it's more efficient. But they don't have as good of, I think, I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to finish that sentence. Anyway, here's an image of the Nephilim. And as as you can observe in a lot of, I guess, like conspiracy theorists now, I've even interviewed some, they believe that this was something that happened. And of course, there's the whole Anunnaki mythos. Personally, it's not something I'm that into or interested in. I'm not really I'm not really interested in aliens either. I'm more interested in stuff that I can, I guess, physically prove. Like, I think there really is a strong and heavy connection between the dark occult, is what I would call it, and the Nazis. This is why I'm reading this book. But these mythologies still continue into this day, and they're propagated by like similar types of people that want to scapegoat the Jews for all the problems of the world. And I saw it with my own two eyes. And I was pretty deeply embedded in some of those groups. I'm trying to find my lamp remote. Yes, it has a remote. It's kind of dark in here. I think it's about to rain. Well, let's see if we can continue without it, because I can't seem to find it. All right, so this is Giants in the Earth. Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days. German occult groups did not appear out of nowhere. They had historical antecedents. The new Aryan hero trumpeted by Liszt and Lanz owed his birth to the unholy marriage of early Hindu ideas of racial purity and Darwin's concept of evolution, which was consummated in the 19th century Europe, where German romantics in particular were fascinated with racial theories. The 19th century was remarkable for great change. In Germany, the change was more drastic than in the rest of Europe. Its people had been more completely under the sway of the past. The Middle Ages had still been dominant in agriculture and industry. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, had consolidated land holdings into a fewer and fewer hands, and the land reforms which followed only served to crush the people lower down in the social scale. The Industrial Revolution happened more rapidly in Germany than anywhere else. It went from mining 1.5 million metric tons of coal in 1850, for instance, to 30 million in 1871. From a backward, predominantly agricultural country, it grew almost overnight into a modern industrial state, much as Japan and Sweden did in the 20th century. Mass migrations of people from country to city severed traditional ties. Scientific discovery brought a sharp decline in religious faith, and there was a search for new values which, with which to identify. The state, assuming more and more control, seemed bent on crushing individuality. The European romantics, wincing at the bitter fruits of modern progress, it's just it's so familiar to me. We have a lot of people lamenting progress. Um, is progress really helpful, right? And I guess I get kind of nihilistic about it. I think that wheel in the sky keeps on turning, and there's not really a lot I can do about it other than finding ways to cope uh, or just, having faith in God and Jesus and that kind of thing. So, and I don't think science necessarily can negate the existence of God or Jesus. I think Nietzsche was wrong. I don't think you could actually kill God at all. And I've kind of changed my mind on that. I used to think that God was a man. I was a pretty atheist type person who thought like man created God, so therefore man can kill God. But I now think it's the other way around. Um, and you just, as much as society, people always need to find something to believe in. I think that's where the emergence of things like transgenderism come from. When you live in a society that tries to remove God, it's still the acts of faith or some needing something to believe in still reemerge constantly. I think it's just within human nature. Um, anyway, let's go ahead and keep going here. So, the Romantics delighted in the exoticisms of the East. European role in the Orient and translations of the Oriental classics helped lift the veils from the faces of the ancient Eastern civilizations. What the Europeans caught a glimpse of was a kind of serenity which had disappeared from the West and which was very much desired. So great was the Eastern influence that Victor Hugo observed in 1829 that all the world was Hellenist, and now it is Orientalist. Sorry. Napoleon's army entering Egypt in 1798, not 1978. Let's start that again. Napoleon's army entering Egypt in 1798 found the Rosetta Stone, which scholars labored to decipher. When Champollion solved the riddle, the long lost tongue of that ancient civilization was loosed, and the way opened for the great achievements of the modern science of Egyptology. German archaeologists went along with the Prussian king's expedition in 1842 and further refined the study. The Germans also made important contributions to understanding the real nature of Islamic literature and thought. Persian love poems called ghazals had the greatest effect on the German poets. The most brilliant of these Persian poems were Sufi. In the Sufi tradition, the poems were interpreted as allegorical and mystical revelations of the divine. German poet scholars made use of them to such an extent that Heinrich Heine admonished, quote, "These poor poets eat too freely of the fruit they steal from the garden groves of Shiraz, and then they vomit ghazals." The Muslims had prejudiced the Europeans against the Hindus, whom they regarded as superstitious and degraded. But with the translation of ancient Sanskrit texts, India began to exert a fascination on the West. The philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder read Indian philosophy with enthusiasm and managed to inspire the German Romantics, who were markedly different from the Romantics in Europe at large. Yo, what is going on in Germany, man? More given to morbid bitterness. Herder cautioned them not to be frightened by supernatural elements such as gods moving among men or nature personified. These, he said, were depictions of actual experiences, for on that paradisical river, the Ganges, ew, the golden age still existed. The Romantics could not have been more pleased, longing as they were for just such a golden age. It is to the east, wrote Friedrich Schlegel in 1800, that we must look for the supreme romanticism. And so that's, I think I've said this before, but when you're talking about the occult of, in like the Western sense, a lot of it is sort of just a smorgasbord of different belief systems that they adopted from what was known as the Orient at the time, right? India, and Asia. So, I mean, talk about colonialism. That's kind of like the original occult idea, is to like take what they want from the buffet of these other traditions, these other spiritual traditions. Um, who are we just? Let's look up Johann Gottfried. Please forgive me. I'm not very good at reading these names. Johann Gottfried von. Oh, good. It's filling it in for me. Here's this guy. What are you guys up to in the chat? Let's see. I feel like I need to like plug my computer in. I need to try the diet blackberry Dr. Pepper soon, but I just got a case of sparkling water. Weirdly, this case of Diet Dr. Pepper came from the food bank for me. I had been learning that Nephilim looked like clowns. Oh, oh, whose channel is that? I've seen that guy. It's like Understanding Conspiracies, like a British guy. I think he's sort of the originator of this idea. I've always been into clowns. Well, I don't think it should let you or dissuade you from enjoying clowns. Yeah, and I think it's intellectually lazy. There's sinister Jews, there's sinister kinds of people in every group. And I think there are extreme kinds of people in every group. And I think it's a mistake to generalize. Those are just my thoughts on that. Went through a phase when I was super religious that I thought Nephilim were Neanderthals. Interesting. Oh my God, what if they were? I heard they had red hair. Yeah, the Ganges, I think I've already said this. Like, I've always been like a real sort of spiritual, like on a spiritual journey, and I used to really romanticize India. And now I just see like all these horrible things and like how dirty it is. And it's just, I don't know. I really appreciate civilization. And I appreciate cities when I go to cities if they're like clean and accessible and the infrastructure is good. Like, I'm into civilization. I dig it. I'm not really trying to like go to India anytime soon at this point. So that's just me. I don't have any thoughts on that other than, yeah, it just looks like it would be hard to get around. It looks hot and it looks dirty. And I've been to Southeast Asia, and you know, I mean, there is a difference between Thailand and Vietnam. I might even be going back to Vietnam. I just appreciate order and cleanliness. Um, anyway, let's continue our reading here. I feel like I think my plug is in the living room. So here's the guy who is a German romantic poet, I suppose. Okay, so let's continue. A French version, and I can never say this word, of the Upanishads awakened Arthur Schopenhauer to the wisdom of the East. His pessimistic view of a demonic will, blind and insatiable, compelling all things to share in its futile unrest, had a tremendous influence on German thought, following in with the disappointed mood of the age. Schopenhauer's sterile negation of life was soon imitated by like minds. So let's get Schopenhauer on here because we're talking about him. Oh my goodness. Uh, where am I? I don't know if I read this sentence yet, but I'm going to keep going. Schopenhauer's sterile negation of life was soon imitated by like minds. The cessation of activity for the sake of eventual purification had a definite appeal for tired, hopeless people who could now enjoy renunciation under the cloak of Orientalism. The historian Benedetto Croce observed that this often led to a sad, bitter sensuality, a decay and death, tinged with Satanism and sadism. And I think that's one of the things about, I mean, they're not talking about Buddhism, but I studied a lot of Buddhism. Um, and I think it doesn't offer any hope. It's far too nihilistic. And so that's what I find very interesting about them borrowing from these other traditions is a lot of them end up being really nihilistic, and it's really only Christianity that believes that there's something better after this. So I think that's interesting. And I think it's really foundational for Western civilization. The spiritual journey to the East, undertaken by many German scholars, philosophers, and men of letters, brought a new mythology to a politically, economically, and socially despairing country, a mystical view that all finitude is the result of a fall from the absolute, and the effects of the fall have to be repaired by the course of history. Right? This sounds like karmic retribution. Another idea that I think is really it's not very hopeful. You're just you're born into this fate, etc. um Again, I find a lot of this to be really nihilistic. These writers began to glorify the Middle Ages as a period of dialogue with God, when men, art, and religion had been unified. To restore the lost innocence became their aim. Asia's effect on the West took a terrible turn when the ancient Hindu doctrine of race purity of the ruling class was rationalized by the Germans to demonstrate Aryan superiority over the Jews. In the mid 1800s, German philologists had theorized that their noble Aryan forebears in India had the same mystical symbols and gods as the ancient Germans. A French diplomat and Orientalist, Arthur de Gobineau, let's look him up. I think I have to take a short break to get my battery or my charger. Arthur de. I love it when it fills it in for me. He looks kind of interesting. I don't know if he's supposed to look cross-eyed, but What would you think if they like totally revived these sort of facial hair styles? Um, anyway, let's continue. So this was a French diplomat and Orientalist, and he made race the determining characteristic in the rise and fall of civilizations. His theory was that the racially pure Aryans were bastardized by alien racial elements, producing, by the process of civilization, a decadent people. It was the Semites, he said, hybridized by blacks, who were responsible for the fall. And I wrote a giant exclamation point next to that. His work not only gave an air of pseudo respectability to the budding anti Semitism in Germany, it provided a convenient rationale for the economic and social fall of the nobleman, for his failure to return to paradise. Even the caste system in India, he claimed, had not been sufficiently stringent to protect the ruling elite from the defiling blood of the dark skinned races they had subjugated. His ideas and these things, there are threads of these beliefs that still continue today. I see them on the internet. His ideas penetrated throughout Germany. The German romantics, given a shot in the arm by him, could now view themselves as a natural aristocracy, replacing the older, outmoded feudal aristocracy, which no longer accorded well with the idea of progress. After all, the Teutons, who he had equated with the Aryans, were a superior race. This idea was eagerly seized on and was buttressed by the growing resentment against the Jews. And I'm not sure, I think he talks, or this person talks about Blavatsky, and we did in the previous chapter, but all these root races and how some of them are better than others. These ideas heavily influenced the Nazis and Nazi Germany, particularly Himmler, as we'll see later in this book. In the early 19th century, the Jews had begun to move toward equality and citizenship in Germany. Before then, the mass of them lived in ghettos behind walls, were taxed heavily, and were barred from any work but peddling and petty trade except for a select few, and even then under prohibitions which gave them a bare subsistence. Even the more fortunate, like the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, at the height of his fame in 1776, reported that to enter Dresden he was forced to pay a head tax, equivalent to that set for a Polish cow. Ludwig Born, a satirist born in 1786, writing of his boyhood memories in a Frankfurt ghetto, recalls, quote, "There they rejoiced in the tender watchful care of the government. On Sundays they were prohibited from leaving the ghetto lane to spare them from being beaten up by drunkards. Before the age of 25 they were forbidden to marry, in order that their offspring prove sound and sturdy. On public holidays they had to re-enter the ghetto gate by sharp 6 in the evening, lest overexposure to the sun ruined their complexions. They were forbidden to stroll in the fields beyond the city wall, so as to run no risk of being attracted to the life of a farmer. When a Jew walked the city streets and a Christian cried, 'Mach Morris Jude, your manners, Jew,' he needed to remove his hat. In this way, proper politeness was maintained between the two faiths. Then, too, a great many of the streets, their bumpy pavement was bad for the feet, were altogether closed to him." After the German emancipation of the Jews, which took several decades to complete, there was a huge influx of the Jews from the Eastern European countries, which were still guilty of fierce persecutions. Life in Germany was more hospitable to them. But in time, the majority of Germans, scratching out a bare living themselves, began to resent them. Bjorn understood well the hostility of these Germans who flattered themselves that no matter how low their estate, They were at least not members of an inferior race. The poor Germans, living in the lowest floor, oppressed by the 7 floors of the upper classes, their anxiety is made lighter by speaking of people who still who are still lower than they are, and who live in the cellar. Not being a Jew provides them with consolation and not being a state counselor. And so I think this also is really parallel to a lot of the people that end up becoming like either racist or anti-Semitic. They're not satisfied with what's going on in their lives, so they find someone else to blame. And even the Germans have a word for this kind of feeling, this Schadenfreude, right? Where you look at somebody else's conditions that are worse than yours and you feel better about your own conditions. And like as a side note, I think that's why certain forms of reality TV are kind of popular, because it gives you that sense that, well, at least my life's not that bad, right? I think my computer, hold on. I need to take a short break because I think my computer might die if I don't plug it in. So I'm going to put my little leaves back on. I'll return in just a moment here with my charger. All right, let's see if you guys are chatting it up at all. Yeah, and a lot of those accounts I think on X are not even Americans. They're just people posing as Americans to create division. Like I think a lot of them are like Pakistani accounts or Russian accounts, maybe even Chinese. Like I don't trust anything I see on there. The ruling classes always need a scapegoat for their own injustices. All right. This chapter is not very much longer. What should we look at? What image should we look at? Gobenale. Let's see. Gobenale. Gobenale. Gobineau. Oh, didn't we have a picture of him open? Right. Okay. So he became the prophet for all those poor Germans and provided them with a philosophy which preached the nobility of the Aryan by simple virtue of his birth. I was actually, this is a tangent. One of the things I like to watch sometimes are documentaries about North Korea. And their origin story of having special blood is so fascinating. And they, of course, borrowed some elements from Christianity. And if you ever get a chance, or if it's something that interests you, how these justifications for power seem to repeat themselves as memes, right? I have this superior blood. Everyone from the royals to the Kims of North Korea, they do things like this. Which I find very interesting. Sometimes I think the human imagination is actually kind of limited. From this eminent source, they learned that contamination of race would lead to certain decline of Germany. The growing Volkisch movement began an active battle against the Jews, the defilers of their blood, reinforced by a pseudo-scholarly writer who satisfied their desire for academic respectability. Rightist pan-German groups also bolstered their ideology by citing the dubious philosophical, historical, and scientific analyses laid out by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an Englishman in love with German culture. So let's look up our friend Houston Stewart. Stewart? Uh, yeah, Stewart. Let's look up this guy. All these guys look so like creepy. Like, what is this? Why do you look like that, bro? All right, so here's an Englishman who is obsessed with German culture. I've met people like that. I don't understand it myself. I've been to Germany. I don't really feel like going back. I think we were talking about that the other day. Anyway, though painfully dull, his two-volume Foundations of the 19th Century, published in 1900, had a strange appeal. He told a mass society at the mercy of impersonal forces which were crushing it that the Teutons were master builders, that in mysticism was freedom, that every mystic is, whether he will or not, is born an anti-Semite, and that Darwin's theory of natural selection justifies the stricture against the mingling of the races. Even before Chamberlain, Volkish thinkers had tried to weave together lessons from history, proving the heroism of the ancient Germanic past. Many of them were admirers of the Theosophical Society, which combined for the first time certain elements into a cohesive system considered by some people to be the beginning of modern occultism. The Theosophical Society was organized in New York City in 1875 by Madame Helena Petron- Petro- by Blavatsky, okay, a Russian expatriate countess known to her disciples as HPB. At 17, her family had forced her to marry an elderly Russian general whom she promptly deserted. Headstrong, convinced, let's just put Blavatsky up. I never actually get sick of talking about this. All of these people involved in the early traditions of Western occultism, which again is just a smorgasbord of Orientalism. So here she is. Headstrong, convinced that she had powers and versed in many languages, she wandered about Europe and the East and decided at age 40 to come to New York to investigate spiritualism, which had become an American craze. Right? So, spiritualism is just the idea that one can communicate to the dead. That's what they were very interested in, passing the barrier between the living and the dead and communicating. With the dead in things like seances. I always like to imagine it as just sounds like a really interesting time period, but it also doesn't sound so different from what happens these days. It's just like a different flavor. Um, Her mission, a society historian observed, was to explain its phenomena, expose its frauds, to enlarge its spiritual scope, and to give it the dignity in the world of science which was due. Right? So, spiritualism, the people who were proponents of spiritualism really, really wanted it to be justified by science. And that was kind of their whole motivation. Depleted of financial resources, if not of energy, she delivered up an unlikely package of Hinduism, Gnosticism, and pseudoscience, which had tremendous impact on the intelligentsia of the West. She even converted the Indians themselves to the ancient wisdom in modern dress. And as we read in that book about old Hollywood, Hollywood Utopia, right, the Theosophists would eventually find a young Indian man and say that he was the Messiah and bring him over to the West. And he later rebuked that and kind of became his own cult leader. Um, Her ideas about ancient lost races with secret knowledge of the ultimate nature of reality, the immortal soul perfecting itself through endless rebirths, and mastery of superhuman powers, which could unlock the secrets of the universe if they had been presented by traditional organized religions, would not have been credited. But people were perfectly willing to suspend disbelief of a huge Russian countess with magnetic eyes who smoked cigars and used body language. Darwin's Origin of the Species, published in 1859, had widened the chasm between science and religion. HPB leaped across the chasm with a spiritual concept of evolution. Men could become divine, she said, by advancing in an evolutionary process which was part of an elaborate cosmology affecting whole races. It was possible to thwart evolution, however. Like most occultists, she believed in the old Gnostic doctrine that there were two worlds, one good and one evil. In Gnostic thinking, the spirit and matter were opposed to each other, matter being an interruption of the order of the cosmos, a fall, and therefore evil. The Gnostics posited three classes: spiritual, pneumatic, sorry. Let's try that sentence again. The Gnostics posited three classes: spiritual men, animal men, and carnal or physical men. So we have spiritual man, animal or psychic man, or carnal/physical man. The last were said to be wholly material and could not be saved, their nature being evil. They had not a single spark of the divine in them. Matter, according to the Gnostics, was not the creation of the supreme God, but of a demiurge, an inferior divinity. A famous medieval Gnostic sect, the Cathars, came to identify the Old Testament God Jehovah with the demiurge, creator of the material world and therefore the equivalent of Satan. And I see people still repeating this idea to this day. Within Gnosticism, then, existed the idea that the Jewish God was really the devil, responsible for all the evil in the world, without intending to arouse hatred. I'm not sure about that. Okay, I'm very skeptical that Blavatsky was this nice person. I don't think anyone who comes up with these concepts of root races and some being inferior to others is like not intending to arouse hatred, okay? But this is what the author says, right? So without intending to arouse hatred against the Jews, HPB repeated this Gnostic thinking in her book, The Secret Doctrine. With the Semite, that stooping man meant the fall of the spirit into matter, and that fall and degradation were hypothesized by him with the result of dragging deity down to the level of man. The Aryan views of the symbolism were those of the whole pagan world. The Semite interpretations emanated from and were preeminently those of a small tribe, thus marking its national features and the idiosyncratic defects that characterize many of the Jews to this day: gross realism, selfishness, and sensuality. Yeah, she really, really dusty scholar. Like this has nothing to do with inciting hatred. All right. She talked of a race of giants that existed in ancient days and argued that the occasional appearance of giants in modern times proved that species tend to revert to the original type. She held that since the days of the giants, whose descendants the Aryans were, there had been an unbroken succession of semi-immortal adepts living in secret cities in Tibetan mountains. It is it is they who had appointed her as their emissary. Because of the flamboyance of her personality, if not her prose, HPB became the model for other aspiring occultist leaders. She had somehow managed to make magic, witchcraft, and alchemy respectable. With the support of educated people, her ideas spread. She brought to the last decades of the 19th century a universal palliative for the main materialism which it was suffering. And that's what happens when you turn away from Christ. These things come up and become popular. That's just what I think. And I think, these ideas are very dangerous. The Volkish writers made capital of both theosophy and Darwinism. Darwin's book had been hailed in Germany with an acclamation in startling contrast to the storm of protest which greeted it elsewhere. In a place of dogmatic Christian theology preaching a millennium, there came a conviction that human society was moving blindly toward some ideal goal. The struggle for existence, palpable to every German, justified itself in this evolutionary scheme of nature. Origin of Species sold briskly in Germany. The Germans eagerly pressed Darwin with their own writings on the subject, lauding his work. It was said that although Darwin was English, Darwinism really came into its own in Germany. Hey, I'm going to pause here. Do you guys believe in evolution? What do you think? Let me know. As one German scientist pointed out, you are still discussing in England whether or not the theory of Darwin can be true. We have got a long way beyond that stage here. His theory is now our common starting point. To a growing body of anthropological concepts was now fused the idea that karma, right, of the Aryans was to engage in a race struggle to the death against the Jews. Germans, the fittest to survive, were destined to become the saviors of the human race. For this, Guido von List preached they would need a strong man from above who could be reincarnated from an ancient soldier. So let's go back to our picture of List, and there he is. List's study of the origins of Jewish mysticism had taught him the importance of imbuing a people with a messianic hope. When the world is changing and the old knowledge becomes suspect, it is necessary to herald the coming of a Messiah so that the traditional verities may be adapted to new conditions. List gave the Germans, in effect, an opportunity to become competitors of the Jews for the honor of the chosen people. His secular messianic nationalism was taken seriously by many confused apostles. The German people were to take their place at the head of all nations, act as their leader, and move towards civilization. They were the chosen people, and soon a Führer would rise among them, who in turn would lead the messianic nation. Just before World War I, then, side by side with an awakening interest in occultism, went an interest in racist nationalism. Germany's supremacy was proved by the ideas and events of the distant past, when the Teutons lived close to nature and far from modern artificiality. All of this sounds so familiar to me. The call of the elemental, the breath of the woodland, the simple poetry of wanderlust, of joyous roving, asserted themselves. The folk tales and folk songs issuing from the lips of peasants became sacred. Primitive German institutions and folklore were eagerly studied. Whereas for primitive people, whereas for primitive peoples, nature often represented my goodness, this is why I don't read longer than an hour. Whereas for primitive peoples, nature often represented primordial chaos and therefore the enemy. These neo primitives idealized nature and saw the city as profane, an aberrant discovery of modern man and his wickedness. Imagination, feeling, and will attributed to natural man were placed above reason, which was held responsible for the psychic disorders of civilized man. The irrational was recognized as a source of illumination. Liszt and his theosophical friends claimed to have a secret science by which they could intuit and the past and divine its meaning. Through extrasensory powers, they could communicate with ghosts who hovered around ancient soil and the cracks of ancient buildings. Innocent and pastoral at first, this movement back to nature and simplicity gradually grew more and more patriotic, more and more German, to the exclusion of other races, and more anti Semitic. Both the occult and the racist nationalist movements were hostile to modernity. These themes never stopped, okay? Um, I see people out there on the internet, you know, and I do think a lot about transhumanism, about AI, a lot about these things. These are things that occupy my mind. But I also don't think a return to feudalism is, really viable at all. And I see a lot of like neo feudalists out there. So, um, anyway. It's just interesting because I think if you're aware that these ideas are just the same, that it's easier to spot that they're not very good ideas, in my humble opinion. Um, okay, where was I? I don't know if I'm repeating myself. Right, they're hostile to modernity. Um, so let's start that paragraph over again. Both the occult and the racist nationalist movements were hostile to modernity. Both promised a millennium. If all the former were not anti Semitic, all the latter were. They saw in the Jew the exemplar of the modern man, urban, alienated from the soil, materialistic. Both movements were essentially conservative in that they harkened back to a quote unquote golden age. The groups often intertwined. Under the influence of Liszt and Lanz, whose works they studied, Volkisch youth groups pressed for the expulsion of Jews from their organizations, from university life, and from government. Admirers and disciples of both men became agitators for a final solution to the Jewish problem. Some saw that solution only in extermination. Hey, it kind of reminds me of those pro Palestine people on the Ivy League campuses of today. The more things change, eh? Both also hailed the Middle Ages with uncritical admiration, whereas the rest of Europe tended to brand that period as an era of darkness from which it had been happy to emerge, and to hold up the Renaissance as worthy of adoration. Germans idealized the Middle Ages as the most illustrious period of their history. Um, the structure of medieval society appealed to their longing for political security. Their morbid worship of the 12th century German crusaders, the orders of the Teutonic Knights, for instance, was based on its mystical hierarchical structure, its secrecy, and its supernatural claims to world domination. Indeed, according to some people, the thousand-year conspiracy of the conquest which the Teutonic Knights had threatened did persist into the 20th century. The marriage of occultism and nationalism is not as uneasy as it might appear on the surface. Each represents a nostalgia for a long-lost paradisical state and a commitment to restoring that state in some millennial time. It is natural for people who feel uncertain about the future to look back sentimentally to a glorified past which they try to relive. The Irish theosophist William Sharp, who also wrote under the name Fiona MacLeod, was a nationalist occultist. Is that the I feel like I feel like my ex's mother gave me a book by this person. They are Irish. Um, so the Irish theosophist William Sharp, who also wrote under the name, I got to look this up. Do you guys know who this is? What is his name? William? William Sharp. William Sharp. Author. It's probably this guy. The Irish always do have nice hair, though, huh? I've never heard of him before. Let's see. It says Scottish here. I don't know. I don't know how much I can trust Wikipedia. So he often wrote as this Fiona MacLeod. So either this book is wrong, or it looks like he was into Hermeticism. So surprised. Yeah, so I guess where did he write? Maybe I'm wrong. I'm thinking of something else that this Irish lady gave me to read. Well, anyway, Scottish or Irish, there he is. So he was a nationalist occultist who, hold on a second, who understood the connection between the patriotic longing and the longing for the occult. He said, I think our people have most truly loved their land and their country and their songs and their ancient traditions, and the word of bitterest savor is that sad word exile. But it is also true that in love we love vaguely another land, a rainbow land, and that our most desired country is not the real Ireland, the real Scotland, the real Brittany, but the vague land of youth, the shadowy land of heart's desire. And it is also true that deep in the songs we love above all other songs is a lamentation for what has gone away from the world, rather than merely from us as a people, or a sighing of longing for what the heart desires, but no mortal destiny requites. It is not at all unusual to find such feelings of, I'm going to mess this word up, of Weltschmerz in those periods when reason seems to have failed us and death and disorder waits to swallow us up. At such times, an interest in the occult gains ground steadily and tries to reintegrate the shattered cosmos. That's like a Kabbalistic concept of, what is it, the shattered cup that they have to put back together. Interesting. This was the climate in Germany before World War One, and the war intensified it. So that's the end of chapter 2. I am not going to continue. I feel like I can't read anymore. Let me see if any of you guys are chatty. Let's see here. What's going on here? What is this? Oh, Frigid Rigid is back. What is that? Analyses? Oh, analysis. Yeah, I'm sorry. I sometimes I can't read very well. Yeah. Blavatsky is full of it. I can't stand Gnostics either. What it really translates into is a hatred of this whole entire realm, which I think is made by God, and it is beautiful. And I think it really prevents people from seeing the world as a beautiful place. And that's kind of my breakdown of it. I don't know about you, but I know about me. And there ain't no monkeys in my family tree. What the heck? Of course, we're all closely related. Hard to believe we have much in common with spiders, but yes, all life has a common ancestor. Oh, you were referring to when I asked about evolution. I go back and forth. I think it's also a faith-based concept. And I think it does remove people from God as the creator. And when I look at nature, things like fractals and the way nature represents itself, it does look like there's a divine hand creating it. That's just what I think. We're all closely related. Not to be racist, but being German is a mental illness. No comment. What? The only thing worse than capitalism is feudalism. Well, GM Carr knows that I think capitalism ain't so bad, and it's what we got. And I think there are ways to improve society. Call me an optimist. Much better than the German hair we've seen, I know, right? I saw something funny the other day on Twitter that they said only the pure at heart have good hair. I think that's funny. Ireland does have some very attractive people. Yeah. I don't know if I recommend dating them, but they do. I mean, I love Yates. So I think they have some very interesting people, very talented people. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with the Irish. Frigid says, is God an ineffable absolute or a corporeal being that's also like a man and has a particular personality like in the Bible? In my estimation, God is unknowable. It's too abstract for us to even understand. That's just what I think. Hello. I'm probably not going to be on much longer, but it is interesting to read your comments. It is pouring outside down here in Florida. Evolution and faith can coexist. Yeah, I mean, I think science and faith can also coexist. But it's not something I have a strong opinion on. I don't actually have that many strong opinions. I'm kind of your poet philosopher type. I can be, if someone has a good argument, I'm willing to listen. Although I will have to say I'm not easily convinced of anything either. So I'm still working on this piece I'm calling Mimetic Murder. I've said it like 5 million times already. I think I'm just going to bite the bullet and record it. I have CapCut just constantly open with like the beginning sequence. So I think I'm just going to do it. So yeah, I think that's all from me for today. I hope this was interesting. I'm going to continue. This book's not very long, so I'll probably end up finishing it. So for people who just got here, we were reading this book called The Nazis and the Occult by Dusty Sklar. And I'm not sure who this person is. And I don't even remember why I purchased this book, because it was sometime in 2020 or 2021 or something. But I'm kind of intending on reading a bunch of the books that I have laying around, because I have quite the library. And it's pretty fun to read and interact with you guys and share pictures of these historical figures. And I also have to like make a disclaimer, like I might not agree with everything these authors are saying. I just think they're interesting. I think people get that mixed up, that like reading books is an endorsement of said book, but I often don't agree with everything these authors say. And I think that's the beauty of reading and having critical thought. So you're welcome. Yeah. I will catch you guys on the flip side. I hope everyone's having a great time doing whatever they're doing today. Be well. I guess, I'll end it with peace in the Middle East, y'all. Take care.